So welcome again to today's webinar, Supported Decision Making and Accommodation for Voting. These times are unprecedented in many ways, and this year's presidential election will be truly historic. Thank you for joining us as we strive to ensure and protect the voting rights of all voters with disabilities, including people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, who have been targeted for exclusion from this process. GAO also understands that people experience marginalization across many identities, and we are committed to ensuring that Black Indigenous people of color, those experiencing wealth or income inequality, trans-identified persons, and speakers of languages other than English have access to fair and accessible elections. I'm going to begin introducing our speakers. We have with us today several people, and I just want to say what a pleasure it's been to work with them to bring you this content. Samantha Crane is the legal director of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network's national office. She's a graduate of Harvard Law School, and she previously served as staff attorney at the Bazelon Center of Mental Health Law, focusing on enforcing the right to community integration as established by the Supreme Court in the Olmstead decision. Michael Kendrick is the Director of Initiatives for Supported Decision-Making at the Center for Public Representation. And he spent the last 20 years in international consulting, and prior to that was the Assistant Commissioner for the Massachusetts Developmental Services Department, Director of the Institute for Leadership on Community Development, and a consultant to the International Initiative on Disability Leadership. John McCarty is an active self-advocate. Thank you for the notes about the screen sharing, I apologize. An active self-advocate, and he presents on disability issues to a wide variety of audiences throughout Georgia and the US. John is a 2019-2020 SARTEC Fellow and consults with the Georgia Advocacy Office on Supported Decision-Making, where he also serves on their Supported Decision-Making Advisory Council. John is here today with a communication partner who will be reading the presentation he created. If there are questions for John, he will respond by typing answers and sharing his screen. My name is Dana Lloyd. I'm the Director of the Developmental Disabilities Program at the Georgia Advocacy Office. I also lead our work on supported decision-making, which is a joint effort with the Georgia Council on Developmental Disabilities. I'll now turn this over to Sam.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Crane. I am the legal director at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. And I'm going to be talking you through a few sort of basics of voting and what voting means for self-advocates.
Sam, I'm just going to interrupt for 1 second. I'm sorry. Are there still problems with the slideshow?
Yeah, right now I'm looking at the presentation view, which shows the first slide, next slide.
Right, and I'm hoping that this is the first slide. Okay, let me get back to I'm trying to find the presentation view so that I can.
I should be able to address this. I apologize, everyone. Give me 2 seconds.
Because I just want to make sure that way I can look at the screen while also.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Is that the view everyone is expecting?
Yeah, what is voting?
Yeah, we're looking at the slides.
Okay.
All right, I apologize. We should be good to go. I will hide my screen now and mute myself and get us back on track.
Okay, so voting is a way to make decisions, and it's used to make all kinds of choices. when you have a lot of different people and they have to make a choice together, one of the fair ways to make that choice is to have everyone vote, and the choice that the most people choose is the one that we make. Voting gets used for small decisions. For example, friends can vote to decide what flavor of ice cream to buy. If you have 5 friends together, they want to buy a tub of ice cream to share, they might vote and decide that the flavor that the most people want is chocolate chip. Or they might decide the flavor the most people want is vanilla. It does, it's up to that group of people what choice to make. Voting can also be used for more important decisions, like deciding who runs the government or passing a law. And we're going to talk about those bigger decisions today. These big decisions can be made at different levels. So you might vote locally for your mayor, the mayor of your city who helps run the city, or a city council who helps make decisions and laws for your city, or your town. It might be made at the state level. So you might be voting for the governor of Georgia or your state legislature. Those are the people who make the laws in your state. It can also be made at the national level. You might vote for your senator who helps make laws on a national level, or the president of the United States. You could vote for who you want to be president of the United States. And sometimes you're voting directly on a law. That sometimes happens, especially at the state and local level, where they'll say, do you want this to be the law? We're going to have a sales tax on something, or we're going to say that you aren't allowed to do a specific thing, or you are allowed to do a specific thing. So sometimes you can vote on laws directly and not just on people that you want to represent you. So what can I vote for? I kind of already talked about this, but the President of the United States, that's on the national level, they make decisions for the whole country. A member of Congress, Congress is part of the national government. They make laws for the whole country, and it has the Senate and the House of Representatives. And you would be voting for who you want to represent you in the Senate or the House of Representatives. And that person would be making decisions on what laws to make for the whole country. A state government, a state governor, they make decisions only for their state. So for example, the governor of Georgia. State representative makes laws only for their state. A city council member makes laws for the city. A mayor makes decisions for the city. And sometimes, again, you can vote directly to accept or reject laws. You have to be 18 years old on the day of the election. You have to be a US citizen. You have to be registered to vote. And you have to live in the place where the election is happening. So if you live in Georgia, you can't vote for the senator of Michigan. You have to vote for the senator of Georgia. But anyone in the whole country can vote for the president. Next slide. Voting is one of our most important rights. It's how we speak up for ourselves, and it's how we fight for the laws we believe in. If you don't vote, then you don't get a say in who is the president, or who is your senator, or who is your governor. Laws affect our lives, and voting lets us have a say in what laws are made. Voting lets us have a say about who's in charge of the government, and voting is just as important for people with disabilities as it is for everyone else. In fact, if we're, for people with disabilities, we are the best experts on what we want, what laws we want, especially the laws that affect us. And so that's why it's important that we vote and not just leave it to everyone else to vote. Next slide. It's also our civic duty and responsibility as citizens of the United States. We want the best people to represent us in the presidency, in the Senate, in the House of Representatives, and we need to make sure that the best people are there. So if you have an opinion on who would be the best person, it's important for you to help vote and make sure that that person wins. Voting upholds the Constitution and reinforces the values of living in a democracy. Democracy is one where the majority, it matters what the majority thinks. The majority of people have to vote for a governor in order for the governor to win. And it's important that the governor represent the majority of people. It helps us communicate our choices and our opinions. And it really matters to our daily life because laws can affect our access to health care, transportation, Medicaid, and things like that. And here's a quote from one self-advocate: in all seriousness, it just makes you feel like it just makes you feel part of the, you're doing your civil, I can't talk right now. You're doing your civic duty. Next slide. So how do you make a voting decision? You talk to others about issues and candidates. You think about what's most important to you. What issues are most important? What things do you look for in a politician that are really important to you? You can watch or listen to the news. You can read newspapers, magazines, or books. That's a good way of knowing what's going on, what laws or policy decisions are being made that might affect you. You can look up candidates online. They all have websites, and on those websites, they often have materials that tell you how they feel about different issues, and that could be healthcare, that could be taxes, that could be Social Security, that could be transportation. All of those issues, they might be talking about them. And some candidates even have special pages for their disability policy. You can contact candidates and ask questions. This is especially true for local candidates or state candidates. They often really like to hear directly from people. Your senator or your representative might really like to hear from you. You can watch debates, especially like for president, there'll be debates on TV where the two candidates argue with each other over over how to lead the country. Another thing I want to point out is that sometimes you can talk to what's called canvassers. And these are people who might call you or come to your door. That's not going to happen as much under COVID, but sometimes people will even come to your door and they'll want to talk to you about a candidate. These are usually volunteers who really, really like a candidate and they want to help that candidate win. So they're often really good sources of information about what that candidate thinks. And I like to talk to canvassers, especially about local elections. Early voting. So there's lots of different ways to vote. Early voting happens a little bit before the election at places chosen by each county. It's usually some sort of polling place, but not all of the polling places necessarily have early voting. You can look up on the website, on the Board of Education elections website, this link is down at the bottom of the slide, how to find more information about early voting. Your absentee ballot allows you to vote before an election if you can't vote in person on election day. This is, for example, if you are in the hospital or if you're traveling or if you can't make it to a polling place in person, you can send in an absentee ballot, but it's important to do that before the election so that your ballot gets there in time. You can also vote in person on election day at your local polling or voting place. That's a place you're usually assigned a polling place when you register to vote. It's based on your address. So it's usually very close to you. And if you are curious about where your polling place is, it's usually on your voter ID, or you can look it up again, probably online at the Board of Elections website. It says find your polling place. Next slide. So other things that you need to know. Poll workers, these are people who work at the voting place. Their job is to help people with the voting process. They have to be neutral. They are not working for a candidate. They are not trying to push their opinion on you. They're just there to help you vote and make the choice that you want to make. A ballot, that's the list of candidates you can vote for. If you get an absentee ballot, it's basically a piece of paper that you mark off which candidates you want to vote for. You can also, there's also sometimes laws on the ballot or rules on the ballot that you vote whether or not to accept or reject that law. That's called a ballot initiative. And the ballot, if you go to a voting place, sometimes your ballot is electronic. So you go to a machine and you use the screen to pick who you want to vote for. And depending on where you vote or what kind of machine it is, it will sometimes print something out that will be your paper ballot that you then take and put in the ballot box. Ballots are, I want to also add in, ballots are secret. You don't have to tell anyone who you vote for, and no one gets to look at your ballot unless you want to show it to them. An absentee ballot, sometimes you might need help filling it out, but you have a right to choose who helps you, and you have a right to privacy so that no one can push you to vote for who they want you to vote for. In Georgia, having a guardian does not mean that you can't vote. The judge's order granting guardianship has to clearly say that you're not allowed to vote. And that's not always going to be the case. So unless a judge specially said that you can't vote, just because you have a guardian, that doesn't mean you can't vote. And now I'm going to hand it off to John to continue.
All right, as Dana said when we started, I'm John's communication partner because John uses a letterboard to communicate, and he has written me a script, and this is his voting story. I've always been interested in news. The news about how and what the government was doing has always fascinated me. Even before I could spell my thoughts as a way to communicate, I listened to NPR News and my family talking about current events. And then my world exploded. The world changed significantly for me in late 2014 when I learned to use a method of spelling as a way to communicate. I point to letters on a laminated letterboard, or I use a keyboard. That's a story for another day. The ability to let my thoughts be known changed every aspect of my life. Why not how I engaged as a citizen? I was starting to speak what was on my mind about various parts of my life. I was standing up for myself and others like me. Voting was a natural extension. I was at the office of Georgia Driver's Services to get an official state of Georgia ID when the customer service representative asked if I wanted to be registered to vote. My mom said no, because she was my guardian. But I knew that that would not be the end of it. I kept bringing it up every chance I got. And her answer was always the same. I was under guardianship. Finally, I wore her down and we did a bunch of research. She was unsure of whether or not guardianship precluded my voting and could not find a clear statement in my guardianship ruling. Our research included the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law, and the American Civil Liberties Union. Although for us it was not completely conclusive, the research indicated that I should be able to vote. Eventually, we decided to just go for it. We have since confirmed that in Georgia, if a guardianship order does not specifically say that voting is not allowed, a person under guardianship has the right to vote. I registered online using my Georgia ID number. Next slide. I was ready now to exercise my right as a citizen of the United States of America. I was on top of the world. I had been able to identify a right that was being denied to me, find a supporter who would eventually listen to me, get that supporter to become my champion, and push the registration through. Now came the critical part. How would I vote? Not for whom, but would I do it in person or by mail? And if I did it in person, would it be on election day or early? The idea of voting by mail came from my mom. She was not sure that she would be allowed in the voting booth with me. Since I need physical support, I knew I could request a mail-in ballot. What came next was requesting the ballot. And then the full ballot came in the mail. And now came the fun part, the research. I dived deep to learn as much as possible about each of the candidates. My sources of information included the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the regional metropolitan daily newspaper, the League of Women Voters, information that was in the AJC as well as at their website, ballotopedia.com, that's a website with comprehensive information on all state and national races, candidate websites, and the North Fulton Neighbor, which is my local weekly town newspaper. When I had questions that were not answered in any of those places, I emailed the candidates. When I spent time thinking about what was important in my life, disability issues rank right up there. That was the topic of my emails. Some candidates never responded. Some gave complete and detailed answers. My vote was guided by both non-answers and detailed ones. Once, the response I received from a candidate to my question, "Where do you stand on disability issues?" was, "What issues?" Well, he wasn't getting my vote. After deciding for whom I was voting, the next step was to fill out the ballot. I had a supporter help me fill in the bubbles and get the ballot into the envelope. I signed the sealed envelope, as did my supporter, and then into the mail it went. During this pandemic, most counties have drop-off boxes. I vote in every election, local, state, and national, including runoffs. At first, I had to request a ballot for every election. And for the last 2 elections, the ballots have just showed up. I have already requested a ballot, just to be sure, for this election. If you request a ballot and it does not come in the mail, you can still vote. I did that once for a runoff election. Once you get to the polling place, you sign an affidavit saying that you never got the absentee ballot. When I make decisions, I need support. I'm autistic, and that means that my brain does not do a very good job at controlling my body. I cannot read to myself because my eyes do not work together and I cannot track words on a page. I need help accessing the internet. The support I need will be different than the support other people need. Some people might need pictures or videos. Others may need large print or simplified language. Others may want to role play. Dana will talk about specific supports later on in the presentation. And while I know that I need support on voting decisions, I want the vote to be recognized as my own. Because of that, it's important to choose the right supporter. Think about the people who believe in you no matter what. Who sees you as competent? And who do you trust to honor your civil right to vote? Those are the supporters for your voting plan. Your voting supporters may be from different areas of your life, not necessarily the people who support you every day. It should be fluid and it should be driven by you. When I'm making decisions, I use a framework of simple questions. Basically, I ask myself, what do I know and what do I need to know? In terms of voting, while you're working with your voting supporter, ask yourself these questions. Are you eligible? Are you registered to vote? Do you have a Georgia ID? Do you follow the news? Does any issue stand out for you? I think about issues in major categories. Not everyone places the same priority on things. What's important to you? Listen. Is it Medicaid expansion? Bless you, dude. Is it Medicaid expansion or affordable and accessible housing? Maybe it's accessible transportation and inclusive education. Maybe it's real pay for real jobs. Maybe the issues that are important to you are totally unrelated to disability. Do you know who are your representatives and your senators? What kind of job have they done? Do they approach the issues that are important to you in a way that you agree with? You need to start to research for each candidate and tie it back to the issues that are most important to you. The person already representing you is known as the incumbent, and incumbents will have a track record. Both incumbents and challengers will have policy statements as part of their campaigning. Do these statements reflect your values? Do the records of the incumbents actually match what they are saying? A candidate may say one thing and actually do the opposite. You need to think about actions. Some people with or without disabilities don't like to research in depth. Many trust their instincts. Others take recommendations from neighbors or their church communities. Some organizations endorse candidates. If you're a member of an organization, you may want to trust the research that they've already done. Always be sure that your decision is your own. If you feel pressure to cast a vote one way or the other, you need to rethink who is supporting you. Think about how you want to vote physically. Are you comfortable going to a polling place? And how will you get there? Once there, what kind of support will you need? Will you need someone to read or to help you mark the ballot? It's a good idea to have your voting choices written down. If you want to go to a polling place, early voting might be for you because the polls might be less crowded.
Thanks, John and Sam. We really appreciate you sharing that information with us. We're going to talk a little bit now about getting prepared to vote. We're going to cover voter ID and getting registered, look at some of the Georgia websites. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about supported decision-making and voting specifically, and then get to some of your questions. So let's talk about IDs for voting. So in Georgia, any valid state or federal government issued photo ID including a free voter ID card issued by your county election you can use to vote. A Georgia's driver's license, even if it's expired, you can use to vote. A valid employee ID from any branch, department, agency of the US government or Georgia or any county or town, any other entity of the state, you can use to vote. A valid passport, a valid US passport, a valid US military photo ID, or a valid tribal photo ID. If you don't currently have a valid photo ID that you can use to vote, then you can contact your state, your county election board and receive a free voter ID card. And it can be issued at any local county election office. You must provide another photo identity document or another document that proves your full legal name and date of birth. And some evidence that you're already registered to vote, which might be your voter registration card, and a document showing your name and residential address. If you have questions about getting a free voter identification card, you should contact your local county election office. In the state of Georgia, the Secretary of State administers elections, and the Secretary of State has a website that has so much information about voting and getting registered. And so you can follow this link, which I put in the chat earlier. There's also an app from the Secretary of State's office you could download for your phone so that you can have access to this information. We're going to go through the website just kind of briefly to point out some things that might be helpful. So this is what the website will look like when you get there. And it'll ask you if you are registered to vote or if you want to register to vote. And if you say, am I registered to vote, it will take you to a page to check your registration. And if you want to register to vote, it will take you to an application that you can use online that John described, where you would enter your Georgia ID number and get registered that way. If you don't have a Georgia ID number, say you wanted to use your US passport to register to vote, it will take you to a place where you can download a paper application. And that paper application can be mailed, faxed. Most county boards of elections have an email option or taken to your county board of elections. You can take that application in and vote. If you click on Am I Registered, you'll get a screen that looks like this. And it'll ask you to enter your first initial, your last name, the county in which you live, and your date of birth. And then it'll show a screen similar to this with your voter information, so your current address, your polling place, so it will tell you the name of the place where you are supposed to vote, an address. It includes the polling place hours for that day. There's even some options to get directions to the polling place, and even some more options to find early voting locations and times. So this page is really helpful if you've already registered to vote. It also has information in the bottom left-hand corner about your absentee ballot request information. So if you have already requested an absentee ballot, here is where you can track it to see that it has been received by the County Board of Elections, where they have sent it back to you, and where your ballot has actually been counted, been marked as received and counted by the election board. So a very helpful website to find information regarding your voter information. So now we're going to talk a little bit about accommodations to vote, and I'm going to talk about these in kind of three broad categories. And one is that any voter can have assistance at the polling place. And that can be someone of your choice, so you can bring someone with you to assist, or a poll worker. And as Sam pointed out, that poll worker is obligated to be a neutral party and assist you in the polling place with the process of voting. You also can bring notes with you into the polling place to help you remember the candidates you want to vote for. So you can take your own notes. Those can be visual reminders if that's what works for you, or a list of candidates, but you have the right to that. There's also technology that may assist people in voting. And every Georgia polling place should be equipped with an accessible touchscreen voting unit. So in Georgia, we use an electronic ballot, and every polling place should have an accessible unit. And the machine will have the following options: an audio ballot where you can have the screen read to you and listen, and a magnifying feature where the text can be magnified on the on-screen ballot, or magnifying devices are required to be present for any paper that someone might need to see. Voting locations themselves are also required to be accessible. There's rules for accessible parking and distance from the polling place, parking to the actual polling place, that there should be a place for people to sit and use the polling machines. And all of that information can be found on this ADA checklist. And I'll get that in the chat just a bit later. I also want to note that in Georgia, elderly or disabled voters can vote without waiting in line if they arrive at the polling place between 9:30 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. on election day. So even if there's a long line and you want to vote in person, you have access to that accommodation. Now we're going to talk a bit about some misconceptions of voters with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The Arizona Council on Developmental Disabilities just recently released a report that highlighted some of these issues. And even though there are options to make elections accessible for people, many people still have a misconception that folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities can't understand how to vote, how to make a decision about voting, that they don't understand the voting or electoral or the legislative process, or that they don't understand the complexities of voting. And there's also a misconception that the support that's available is not enough to overcome these barriers. And so another misconception that people have is that folks may be coerced into or more suggestible to voting on the behalf of others. And this is a quote from a mom who said, "Everyone should vote based on what they believe to be best for our country. And my son, he would ask me, 'Mom, who should I vote for?' Well, I shouldn't tell him that. I shouldn't tell him who I think he should vote for because it's who I would vote for. And I don't think any vote should be tarnished in that way." What we want to talk about today is that there are options, right, to overcome these barriers, and we do believe that they are strong enough to overcome these misconceptions that people have. And that's really the role of supported decision making. And we want to be clear that we see supported decision making as an accommodation, a different type of accommodation, but an accommodation for sure. And supported decision making in general is a process that ensures a person with a disability makes their own decision. It's a tool that allows people to retain their decision making capacity by choosing supports to help them make decisions. It's a combination of relationships, practices, arrangements, and agreements designed to assist a person with a disability to make and communicate to others decisions about their life. And it is a human decision-making process that we all use to gather information, explore our choices, and communicate wishes to others. And I want to point out that some of those misconceptions are kind of unfairly applied to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. There are many people who may not understand the election process. There are many people who may not understand exactly how a bill becomes a law, but there's not a barrier for them voting. And so supported decision making is really based in this human decision making process, and making sure that people have access to all the supports that they might need and that we all rely on. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael to begin to talk about some of the important principles of supported decision making.
Okay, well, everyone can benefit from social support when they make their decisions. And so most people do rely on support depending on the decision, because decisions can be inherently kind of challenging. And our understanding of things can be changed by the things that have influenced us as we go. Now, our capacity changes from day to day to do many things. There are days when you can sort of keep on top of things, and other days in which your energies are scattered. So in this sense, our capacities are somewhat variable. And when we have good support around us, we tend to manage things a lot better. So support acts as a kind of counterweight to some of our limitations at a given moment. Now, with supported decision making, it's really an invitation by the person to the people that he or she chooses to ask them for support on something that the person is struggling with. And so supported decision making isn't imposed on people, it's something the person asks for. And so a person may have a set of supporters that he or she often goes to when there are difficult decisions and invites their contribution. Equally, it's also possible that individuals don't really want support at a particular time or with a particular decision, so they won't seek that out. So supported decision making, and whether it gets used or not, is entirely up to the person. So the person remains in the driver's seat and is the decision maker. So the real question with supported decision making is really, is the support available, and do people have someone they can turn to seek that kind of support with particular decisions? Now, in our society, guardianship removes decision-making authority from the person and gives it to another person. And the other person, by law, then becomes a substitute decision maker and makes decisions on behalf of the person. And the problem with that is that when you have a substitute decision maker like that, it means you aren't any longer making the decision. So supported decision making helps prevent that happening by offering another solution, which is, rather than take away the right of the person to make their own decisions, why not just give people support if they need support with their decision making? And of course, if you're not particularly good at decision making, practice does make perfect, so people can get better over time. So with new things you're unfamiliar with, you might need more support at the outset because it's all new. But at a certain point, you start getting the hang of things, and so you don't need as much support. So in this sense, supported decision-making grows alongside the person, in the sense that the person only gets the support they're seeking or need. Now, we often call these people that support you either supporters or allies. In other words, these are people that are on your side because you pick them. And so this is a very important point about supported decision making, is that you're only getting support from people you trust or you want to involve in some kind of decision that you're trying to make. And typically, the people chosen are people that know the person well. So in that sense, it's be unlikely to choose a complete stranger much of the time. You would go to people you already trust to some degree and are familiar with.
Out here, I can't let anything hold me back.
Okay, so a key thing that's built into supported decision-making is the presumption that people are competent to make their decisions. This doesn't mean that they're competent to make perfect decisions. Otherwise, none of us would be able to vote. But rather that people have competency and should be treated as such. And so the assumption is that people can and should vote. It also, supported decision-making the allies that they have in it know the person learns and that what they need to help process new information. So in this sense, everybody learns in their own way. And of course, if your supporters, the people you're seeking support from, understand sort of how you do things, then when they go to help you, they're going to be more tuned in and more helpful. And that's why it's very important to pick people that are people you trust and that in the sense you feel that they kind of get you. And they support the person to make an informed choice in the sense that often people need to know more about the choice that they're making. And so having people to talk through a particular choice means that at the other end of that, talking through, you feel like you know more or you're basically clearer about a lot of things. So maybe by then you're ready for a decision. In some other cases, it may mean that you're just not ready for a decision yet. You need more time to think about it, or you need to keep learning more about the question. And so often support decision-making involves knowing where to find information and other support if you need it to carry on the process of coming to some kind of decision yourself. And so in this way, every decision may have a different process to it because you start with different information and you don't always need the same support with each and every decision. So the person can become, over time, very educated about where to find the information they need and may not need as much support. Now, voting itself is like many decisions. It's a complicated process that occurs and can include lots of people and activities and systems and barriers. So the voting process isn't by any means straightforward. And as you saw when Dana was laying out the process in Georgia, there are many different aspects to it that people may or may not even be familiar with because they've never encountered it. But in fact, there are many systems built into the way voting goes that if you knew about them, they might be helpful. And so there is a lot to learn about the voting process itself. And of course, if you've moved to Georgia from a different state, you may be familiar with the things in the state you left, but now have to learn that, well, in Georgia, we do it slightly differently from wherever. So in this sense, even in a state, the system may change a little bit from one year to another. And so there's a kind of ongoing learning curve of trying to understand how the system works. Now, the people that are voting are one thing, but the people supporting the voter, what we're calling voting allies or supporters, have to be very clear about their role. And the role they have is that they've been asked by the person to honor their voting choices of the voter. And so they have to be very respectful and ethical about how they support the person. And it is quite possible that well-meaning people don't always support people responsibly. And so they may have to be called on that because they aren't necessarily supporting people in an ethical and responsible way. And that doesn't mean they can't be supporters, but it means that you have every right to ask them to behave responsibly and ethically. And so in this sense, the voter is in charge of the supporters when it comes to that. So in this way, if push came to shove, you could literally fire your supporter. I wouldn't use that word, but you definitely could say, well, I don't really want to use that supporter anymore because they're not respecting my right to make my own choices. And of course, the allies really have another role, which is to help the person with the system itself of voting. Like, how do I do this or that in that system? And so the supporters are really helping people to be much more able to manage the voting process as they encounter it. Now, the thing about being an ally or supporter is you're there not to make a decision. You're there to help somebody else make their own decision. And so it begins with the idea that I'm a supporter. I'm not a decision maker. The person I'm supporting is the decision maker. And that decision they're going to make is a private decision. It's a private, personal decision that they're going to make. And I have no right, if I'm a supporter, to go tell other people about private matters that were discussed with the person I support. So in this sense, this is a part of the ethics of being a supporter, is you must be respectful of people's privacy. It's also true that sometimes the voter may get pushed around by other people, pressured, kind of treated in a way that dominates the person, not necessarily by their supporters, by other people. So sometimes what a supporter may do for a person is to help them to figure out how to manage people that are trying to not be respectful of the voter and what the voter wants. And that may not be the easiest thing in the world to do, because some people are very pushy and dominant and don't listen and whatnot. So having strategies to deal with these kind of people that are trying to tell you what to think and what to decide is very helpful, because you can figure out ways of how to manage those kind of people in your life. So the ally or the supporter in the supported decision making is somebody can help you manage not just the voting, but the people that are sort of getting in the way of you doing your own thing with voting. And there may be things that the supporter can do to help prepare the person for the experience of voting, particularly if it's new to them. And so the voter can, if you like, kind of rehearse for themselves in advance how they're going to decide things, and get assistance with how they might go about preparing for some of the processes. For instance, Dana was very clear that people would need, for instance, voter identification. If you don't have that, then they could help you walk through what you need to do to get that voter ID. It's also one of the things that people need to do is to decide whether their supporters are on the right track. And one of the things with supported decision making is that the person can decide that they're not in agreement with a particular supporter on a specific thing, and choose just to ignore the advice they're getting from that particular person. As we do in everyday life many times, we'll hear what people have to say, but doesn't mean we have to follow their suggestions. So supporters, if you like, are good supporters when they're prepared to be ignored by the person they're trying to support. So supporters shouldn't be expecting that every time they suggest something to somebody that the person should, interpret, sort of conform to what that other person thought. Now, the supported decision making then in the concept of the law of the land at the moment is what would be called an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that has a specific kind of legal meaning. It means a reasonable support to a person to allow for their individual unique needs for assistance. And so in this way, supported decision making is very consistent with American law at the moment, particularly the Americans with Disability Act. And it is seen then as a valid support to a person so that they don't experience discrimination or mistreatment or prejudicial treatment in some other way. So in this sense, the use of supported decision making is very consistent with the law of the land at this point in time. And it is a civil and human right. In this sense, the right of people to make their own decisions is a civil and human right. And this is an extension of that recognition. And of course, that recognition shows up in different laws in different countries, but in the international law, there's something called the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that was passed by the United Nations. And in that UN convention, voting and exercising your vote is makes you equal to all other people in your society. So it's people with disabilities and others have the same right to vote and to do many other things. And that's recognized by the United Nations Convention. The presumption of all that is that people do have their own legal capacity to make their own decisions and should be the person making those decisions. Even if other people don't agree with that, the law of the land is that they have no right to take away people's decision-making authority to make their own decisions. So what voting support do I want? It's a very key question. Because you don't want support with everything. So what might be the things that you might want support for? Well, one might be the importance of voting. Many people often think, is it worth the trouble? And they have to work out, is voting important to me at the moment? Or I'm not interested in this election or whatever. So at times people have to sort of make up their mind, am I going to go to the trouble to vote? And that's a decision that they may want some support with. If you're not registered to vote, because perhaps, again, you've come from another state or whatever, or you've never registered in your own state, then that's a decision that has to be made. What support do I need with the registering to vote? And then there's the actual, decisions about the laws and the policies and the candidates and what they believe in, what they don't believe in. And that's a very complicated set of questions that talking it over with people is often quite helpful because you have to get your head around, do I support this person, don't I? Why don't I support them? Why do I support them? How come I feel one way one day the next? All these are trying examples of issues that you have to have time and opportunity to work through before you make a decision. Not everybody does that, I might say. That's important to remember too, that a lot of people don't put a lot of thought into it. But if you're a conscientious voter, most people would put some thought into it and struggle with sometimes who to vote for. And as you might guess, some people need some various forms of physical assistance to vote. And again, this can vary for people depending on which aspect of voting is difficult for them. And the process you're using might vary from one election to another in terms of the type of election. A local city election or town election might have a quite different feel to it from a presidential election. And so the roles of the people you're voting for may change the way you look at the voting process. And sometimes you're voting not just for people, but for particular ballot measures. And those things may be important to you, may not be, as the case may be. And that may vary from state to state, what's on the ballot. So it's quite common that people face decisions they've never made before about subjects they've never had to make a decision for. So that's a struggle trying to get that clear. And so the strategies of support, and these would be some examples of them, is sometimes just getting information that makes it possible to understand things is really big support. Having terms explained to you or words that are unfamiliar Because many people use words that they think they understand, but assume everybody else understands the words the same way they do. So it's quite common that people don't always have the same understanding of words and concepts and things like that. A second kind of support, apart from information, is the support to make sure you do things at the time you need to do them. And that's a support with the actual process of voting and getting registered and, you know, meeting the deadlines and dates and things of that sort, or whatnot. And then which options you're going to use to vote, and how you're going to figure out a method yourself for making up your mind. For instance, one of the points there you can see on the screen is the issue of research. A lot of people need to look into things before they make up their mind. And as they dig into things, they may learn a whole lot of things about a topic they never knew before. So research can help them educate themselves about what's involved in the actual decision. This next point is also very important, which is the make sure that the person's decisions are the ones that get made, that this is really what the person themselves wants to do. And they may be, the voter may be under pressure from all kinds of people to vote one way or the other. And so the role of a supporter is to make sure that the decision is the one the person themselves wants to make, not what the people around them want to make or whatever. And then the needs of the person and what they will require to vote need to be made clear to particular people so that they can get the accommodation they need or the support they need with voting. So the whole point of supported decision making is ensuring that the voter makes their own decision and that they know that they are the person that has the full authority to vote as they wish. This is the key to it. And then practicing it. Like everything else, if you practice, you get better at things. And even if you're not very good at decision making, you can get better at it with practice. And so in this sense, supported decision making isn't something you do once. It's probably likely to be something you do as an ongoing matter, depending on whether you need support with one kind of decision or another. And it's always going to be the case that some people aren't a good influence on you. And there will always be problems of managing the influence others are trying to have over you. So the supported decision-making practice is supposed to be ethical, that the others aren't supposed to dominate you or tell you what to do or whatever. And so the nature of support is to strengthen the ability of the person to come up with their own decisions and then to proceed to make them.
Thanks so much for that, Michael. We are coming to the end of our presentation, so I have a few more things to share, and then we'll get to some questions. You can add questions to the chat. At one point, I'll stop sharing my screen, so you could raise your hand or unmute yourself to ask a question, and we'll do our best to answer. Just a note, if you have questions about rules for voting, we're really only able to talk about the Georgia rules for voting. Sam may be able to answer a couple national level questions, but if you have questions about your state, the best way to get that information is from the county board or the local board of elections near where you live. So here are just a couple of websites for voter information that's national and Georgia. So vote411/Georgia. If you want just national information, you would leave the Georgia off of that. Ballotpedia, same thing. The League of Women's Voter offers a citizen's handbook. And of course, here in Georgia, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution has some information as well. And then we have some information about supported decision making. So there's several websites of some of the presenters that are with us here today. The National Resource Center for Supported Decision Making, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, as well as the Center for Public Representation and the Self-Advocacy Resource and Technical Assistance Center. And then there's some other information about voting as well. So I am going to put a link in the chat soon for a survey. We'd love to hear from you all about how the presentation was today. So that's an electronic survey. And now we're really happy to take your questions. In the chat, there's Zoe said that she had a question. Zoe, would you like to unmute yourself and ask that question now?
I had a question about the rules that we went over for voting.
Okay, what can we help with?
I didn't know what the rules was for
Okay.
for voting, like in a different state.
Sure. So let's see, I stopped sharing my screen, but
I didn't know if it was 18 or not.
yeah, I can go back for 1 second and we can get to that. So here's a quick overview of who is eligible to vote. So you have to be 18 years old on the day of the election. So in most states, if you will be 18 and on election day and you want to register, you can get registered even while you're 17, as long as you will be 18 on the day of the election. You have to be a US citizen, so you have to live here or have become a citizen. You got to get registered, so you got to follow the rules in your state for getting registered and live in the place where the election is happening. So in your city or county, and then of course state or nationally. So those are the real basic rules about who can vote. Some of the things that make it harder for people are things like having a photo ID. So I'll try to get to that set a little bit, right? So these are the Georgia rules about having an ID and what IDs will work. But you'd have to check with if you don't live in Georgia, you'd have to check with your local board of election to find out what the rules are for IDs in your state.
I have another question.
Of course.
Do you have to have a license to vote?
Right. So you don't have to have a driver's license to vote. You do have to have a photo ID, so an identification card with your picture and your address on it. And you have to have a voter registration card, which means that you followed your state's rules to get registered. So those are the two things that you need for sure.
And
so,
can I add, this is Sam, it's different in different states. So you need a photo ID in Georgia, but some states you don't.
Thanks for that clarification, Sam. And someone asked, what happens if I'm registered to vote and I'm 20? So if you're registered to vote and you're already 20, you're over 18, then you should be good to go in your state in order to vote, as long as you have any IDs, if that's something that's required in the state. So the best way to find out, you can follow this information for Georgia. If you live in another state, check your local board of elections. So you could Google that. You could ask a supporter to help you find the local board of elections. If you live in maybe a small place, you could go to your local courthouse and ask if that's where the board of elections are. There's a couple different ways to find that out. But that's how you would find out the information about being able to vote. specifically in your state. What other questions can we answer for people? Questions for John or Michael or Sam?
There's a question in the chat.
Okay, that's a great question. So someone asked, what could be on the ballot? And there's a lot of things that could be on the ballot. So the next election that we'll have is a presidential election. So there will be candidates for president on that ballot. In some states, there may be people who are electing governors. And so the leader of the state will be on that ballot. There will likely be candidates for both US congressmen and senators on your ballot. So people who you want to represent you in Congress. And there could be many other things on your ballot. So in Georgia, if you visit the Secretary of State's website, you can find a sample ballot that will show you exactly what's going to be on your ballot. And if you visit Ballotpedia, one of the resources we showed a little bit earlier, that's another place that you can find a sample ballot to see exactly what's going to be on your ballot, what you'll have to vote for. And that's a good way to practice, is to look through that sample ballot and see what the options are and talk to supporters about how to get more information about those candidates. So someone asked the question if we would recommend bringing information with you to the polling site that will help educate poll workers as it pertains to your rights as an individual with a disability. And that's a great question. If you have that information handy, I don't think it will hurt. Poll workers are supposed to receive training on accessibility. In every state, there's also an organization like the Georgia Advocacy Office, the Protection and Advocacy System. And so if you have trouble voting on the day of, you can call your Protection and Advocacy Office and tell them that you're having problems. There's also a national organization called Election Protection. They have a 1-800 number, and they run that hotline on every election from the time the polls open until the time the polls close. They offer TTY services. They offer that hotline in multiple different languages. So if you're having trouble voting on the day of because of a disability, there's some folks you can reach out to get assistance. I will try to find some resources to drop in the chat about that, but that's a great question, Alice. Let's see if I can tackle some of these other questions. If you finished voting, where can you cast your ballot? Another good question. So if you're at a polling place, a poll worker can help you answer that question. Where do I take my ballot now, or where do I turn in this electronic card? If you are voting from home, you're using an absentee ballot, then there's some ways that you can return that ballot. You can return that ballot by mail. You can, in some counties in Georgia, there are drop boxes where you can return your ballot to a specific place that the county has set up for you to return that ballot. And in some places, you can bring that ballot to a polling place during early voting or on the day of the election. Those are all really good questions. And if you need that information again, then in Georgia, the Secretary of State's website will answer those questions for you. In any other state, you could contact your local board of election to get that information. Someone asked, what day can you vote? Another great question. So the next election in the US right now is November 3rd. So that is election day. Election day changes a little bit every year as to when people can vote, but that is the next upcoming election. Someone asked, where can you go for voting? So that's information that you can find, again, on the Secretary of State's website, the My Voter page here in Georgia, You put in your, if you're already registered, you can put in your information and find your specific polling place. If you're not registered, you can go to the Secretary of State's website and search by county to find where the polling places are. You guys have great questions, and I'm really happy to answer them. So another question is, when could early voting start? That's another question that changes based on where you live. So in Georgia, early voting starts on October 12th. That's the first day that you can vote early, and it runs until October 30th. So every state makes their own rules about how long early voting lasts and when it starts. That's the Georgia information. I think we've got all the questions in the chat. Are there additional questions that I could answer for people? We're happy to, John, Michael, Sam, and I are happy to answer questions as they come up. There's a question that says, what is the difference between states? And the best answer that I can give for that is that while there are national rules about voting, every state's a little bit different, and they may want to make their own rules. And so you would have to check with your state to find out what your state's rules are. We know that makes it a little bit confusing, but the best way to find out is to check with your local board of elections. So someone says that they voted in the last election, but now the My Voter page says that my information is not found. It's a great question, and we didn't highlight it today, that it's important to check your registration status even if you voted before. So we're glad that, that you were checking. If it says that your information is not found, then you have two options. Contact your local board of elections and give them this information. And if you're still having problems with that and you're a person with a disability, you can contact, and you live in Georgia, you can contact the Georgia Advocacy Office or the Protection and Advocacy Office in your state, so they can help you get that sorted out. It's great to be able to check early so you can get a solution to that problem, but you should definitely follow up with your local board of elections. You guys are asking really great questions. Are there more that I can help with? So there's a question that says, will there be voting signs outside of the polling place? And yes, polling places should be marked and identified as polling places. The accessible entrance should be marked and identified at your polling place. And there should be either poll workers or poll monitors who may be outside of a polling place to give you additional information. But yes, polling places should be clearly marked as places where you can vote on election day throughout your locality. So I'm adding the survey link to the chat. I am going to add Ballotpedia, the website for that organization where you can possibly get a sample ballot in your location. And I will find the National Voter Election Protection Hotline so that folks can have that information. And then I will, for Georgia folks, I will get the information for our office, and then a website where you can find the protection and advocacy organization in your state. Someone asked, what time do the polling places close? So unfortunately, guys, that's another local question. So in Georgia, polling places are open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. That time is a little bit different in different states, but most states have a 12-hour window that runs somewhere from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. But that's another great question. Let's see if I can.
I'd like to answer this question about the person whose voter page now says that their information isn't found. You might want to register to vote again. And if you still have a hard time finding your voter information after you register, you can call the election board and see what's going on. Sometimes it's just a mistake in the electronic records.
Thanks for that, Sam. And so the election protection information, that's the website. And here is the phone number is similar, right? So the website is 866ourvote.org. And the phone number is just 866-OUR-VOTE. If you need that information in a different language, you can visit the website, and they give several call-in numbers for different languages. So the person is asking how long after registering, because if they register again. So that information should be reflected on the My Voter page if if it's working correctly. And so I think that if you register again, you should get a registration card, and that'll be your kind of sign that your registration has been completed. But I still think that it wouldn't hurt to contact your local board of elections if you're having a lot of problems or confusion with that process, or contact your P&A if you have a disability. This is a great question. Robin said that her state ID will expire in October, but I can still use it. And that answers yes, Robin, if you live in Georgia. So the Georgia rule says that your ID is still valid, even if it's expired. You'd have to check with your local board of elections if you live in another state. You guys are asking wonderful questions. I'm happy to keep answering them. We've definitely got plenty of time. If you have more questions, or if there's a resource that you want me to specifically include in the chat, I'm happy to do that as well. So here is a website where you can find your protection and advocacy office. So if you're a person with a disability and experiencing trouble voting, you can utilize that website in order to get in touch with them. Okay, I'm getting a few more questions. Will they give you a ticket number to get to the polling place? And Sandy, I'm not quite sure I understand that question, so you can try to clarify it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask it, and we'll try to get you an answer. And then someone's asking, if I send in a mail-in ballot, how can I check that my vote was counted? So there's two ways to do that in Georgia. The Secretary of State's office has launched a new website specifically for absentee ballots. And if you request an absentee ballot through that website, they will actually email you that they have received your application, and you can choose to continue receiving emails along the process. If you did not request an absentee ballot through that website, then the My Voter page will give you the option to check that your ballot application has been received, that your ballot has been mailed back to you, that your ballot has been received, and that your ballot has been marked or tabulated. So you can follow that process through the My Voter page, or through emails if you elect to join the new website. What other questions can we ask? I'm also happy if Michael, John, or Sam have thoughts to share, or more information on a question that we've already covered. You guys can hop in as well. These are really great questions. We're happy that you guys are making a plan now and thinking about voting. That's a super important part of the process, is that you're, especially this year with the challenges related to the pandemic, and the fact that most people are expecting lots of folks to vote this year. Having a plan will be really helpful. How will you vote? John talked about this. Are you going to vote by mail? And I put this in the chat earlier, but in Georgia, you don't have to have an excuse to choose absentee voting. You can just choose it because you want to. You don't have to have a disability or be out of the area. You can just choose to vote absentee. So are you going to choose to vote absentee? Are you going to go in person ahead of the election and use early voting? Do you need a supporter? What's your plan for transportation? Having a plan is really important. And then if you're a person who's excited about voting, like I am, you can also make a plan to help other people vote, right? Encourage your friends and family to vote, or to go with you to vote, or to find out more information about voting. Talking about voting and the election process is really helpful. It helps to get rid of some of those misconceptions about people with disabilities, right? So if you're talking to folks about voting, you're really proving to them that it's something that you care about. And also that when other people that you know and trust invite you to vote, research shows over and over again that more people vote. So it's a really awesome way to solve a lot of issues. So I will add that as well.
One thing I want to say, because actually not a lot of people know this, but if you're going to go vote in person, it's important not to wear a shirt that has a political candidate on it. And that's because there's actually rules in the polling places that you can't be trying to convince other people who to vote for when you're too close to the polling place. That's to make sure that everyone feels safe making their own decision. So when you do go to vote, if you want to go to vote in person, make sure you don't wear shirts, buttons, or anything like that saying who you're voting for. You can have a button, but you have to take it off when you go inside. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Thanks for that, Sam. That's a great reminder. And someone asked a question kind of related to that, and I answered it to them in the chat. But if you're thinking about the information that you might need to take with you for your notes, you want to make sure that those are kind of private. Either the information's folded over so that the outside is plain, or it's in a pocket, so that it doesn't appear like campaign information that people might be concerned about you sharing that information with other people. All right. So someone said that they've signed up to be a poll worker in their county. And during the upcoming training, I will ask our county is helping those who need help to be sure our poll workers are trained. My son has a disability, and he was given simpler step-by-step directions the first time he voted earlier this year. Robin, that's great to hear. There's so many things to highlight from that. Number one, that's a way folks can help with elections. If you feel like it's safe for you to be a poll worker this year, and you're concerned about people with disabilities having access to elections, then you being an informed poll worker is a really great way to do that. It's also great that you could advocate in the poll worker training to make sure that folks have the information that they need, that everyone's talking about accessibility. And it's really amazing to hear that in your location that they have accessible information for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. That's actually really exciting. So thanks for sharing that. Any other questions? Anything anyone wants to share? So in the chat, I've put the phone number for Georgia Advocacy Office, both our number and our 1-800 number. Because this is such an important election this year, GAO is opening their voter protection hotline starting on Monday. So if you are having trouble registering now, you're having trouble requesting an absentee ballot now, you're having trouble during early voting, you can contact the Georgia PNA starting Monday, to get some assistance. We won't be able to answer those calls live, but if you leave a message, we will return your phone call and provide you with assistance. So we're excited to share that information, and those phone numbers are in the chat. All right, you guys, it's been amazing to be with you today. If our presenters have any final words they want to say, you can let me know that. If not, and there's no more questions, we'll get ready to wrap. We've really appreciated the time and the questions. Please connect with Georgia Advocacy Office, the Center for Public Representation, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and the Self-Advocacy Resource and Technical Assistance Center. If you have questions for any of us or for regarding voting or supported decision making, we thank everyone for your time, and we look forward to seeing you on the internet somewhere soon.